what led you to this foreclosed future study? What was the I guess inspiration for it?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. I think there was kind of a period of sort of following the thing that I was felt very interested about. And maybe I wasn't necessarily at the sharp end of living, but those around me were. So in 2012, I started a project that was kind of on the right off the bat of austerity policies in the UK. And so the way that the originally it was the conservative Lib Dem government, and then it was the Conservative government who continued these direct cuts that were made to the public sector, so welfare, education, health, care services, especially, and local government. Um, and the argument was that that was to pay off a national debt. So this idea that these services and these people who are most reliant on them can forego because this national debt is more important. And it's set out to look like it's a very rational argument, but it is an incredibly political decision. It's not the only way that you can pay off a national debt. There are other ways to raise revenue through taxing corporations and so on. Lots of other places have done it differently. But in the UK and in other parts of Europe, there was this austerity policies that were taken on. And so I'd been carrying out projects, long-term projects that were embedded with people in the lives they wanted to show me for many years at that point. So I've been researching austerity and recessions, started doing work around Brexit and devolution around 2016. So Brexit vote and the kind of aftermath. And also at a similar time, and these debates ended up being really interestingly tied together, this Brexit because we want this local devolution. I won't get into that now. So those devolution debates in the UK were playing out, and Greater Manchester was the first place to devolve. So I was kind of watching these economic changes happening, and the people that I was spending time with and listening to were sharing what was happening for them. And in that 2-year ethnography I mentioned before, the the families were saying to me, actually, we always thought we were going to have another child, and we can't. And at that point, you often might think it's anecdotal, but actually, I noticed they were talking about their friends being in the same position and so on. And so it's something I started to kind of watch around. And there's this big European report that comes out. Well, they have reports all the time from Eurofound and Eurostat, these big policy companies across Europe, policy commissions, sorry. And I was reading these reports about how many more young people are living at home than ever before, and how the markers of independence were kind of a bit later in life, but how that has a very direct link to the choices that people feel they can and can't make or have access to about having children. So that particular issue was something that I'd become very interested in. But my argument would be that that is not the only form of reproduction. So we reproduce the everyday in all manner of ways through cooking and cleaning and caring, and we reproduce it by thinking about and desiring better and more. But having children can also be part of that. And it's just really interesting how the economic situation for many people across Europe. So the areas we work in Europe include Spain, Italy, Ireland, and the Netherlands, as well as the UK, but also colleagues who are working in other countries, including Greece and France, are reporting that everyday economic conditions are having such an impact on the most intimate decisions that people make in their daily lives.
Yeah, and I think, to speak a little bit more about that study, I think it was over 100 young people across those countries that like you mentioned. And, I think one of the stuff that I saw that like, young people were constantly talking about that there was nothing to hold on to regarding the futures. And I think that idea of people coming into like the economic force, or coming into, adulthood, realizing that there's nothing they can actually, there's no direction, is something that I feel. And again, like to make it kind of an anecdotal, my friends also talk about it. I think that's what kind of really drew me into this kind of conversation, because I realized that, again, I was surprised someone was out there doing a study about something that was so intimately about my life, that everybody was a quiet part that I was just, because there was no answers to it, it was very hard to kind of kind of like gauge. Can you tell me a little bit more about like what you found when you're talking to these people, when you're talking to these young people? What was that like?
Yeah. So the project you're referring to is kind of the one that came off the back of that reproduction project, the austerity and altered life courses project. And yes, you're very right. We've collated what we call oral histories and futures from over 100 people across the UK, Spain, and Italy. And the idea of foreclosed futures, it really kind of is a bit of a pushback at this idea that people are making decisions and acquiring independence later in life, and we're actually finding people are saying no, we're not having it at all. With that project, we had a very particular idea that we would research people aged 18 to 35, and the reason for that was that at that age, people would have had their kind of most formative years of living, their childhood and their youthhood and early adulthood in austerity. So that was the idea for that. And we were not surprised, but it was quite telling how many people contacted us and said, actually, I'm between 35 and 40, but this is my life too. This is what I'm experiencing as well. And this real sense of an intergenerational shift. One of the things that we've really kind of noticed with our work is, first of all, this idea of foreclosed futures. So the paths, the options, the decisions that young people once thought were available to them, whether it's their education or employment opportunities, whether it's independence in terms of their housing, isn't happening. More and more people are sharing houses than they expected. More and more are in precarious jobs compared to the careers they might have imagined. Many don't have the income or the family wealth to be able to access higher forms of education too. So you're seeing that these things are all kind of, they layer in and they're playing out at the same time. One of the things that's kind of really interesting is the similarities that people experience across different places. That yes, there might be very different reasons why that's happening in a particular country, and austerity has different colors and textures to it, but the way that it ends up kind of being expressed in people's lives can be remarkably similar. And the other thing that we found is that, like other studies, yes, we have noticed there's a sense of there being an intergenerational difference. So young people often talk about their lives and their futures in a relational way. And by that, I mean they're comparing them. And they're comparing them often to their parents' generation or their guardians' generation, comparing them to their own ideas of where they thought they'd be. So there's this like comparing it to yourself. But the other thing we see that's really vital, and this is really growing, is an intra-generational difference. So that's a difference that young people are experiencing between them and their peers. And we also see that happening on a national and global scale, that the gap between the most well-off and the least well-off is growing all the time. And young people can really feel that, even in friendship groups and in, yeah, like I said, peer groups. So I think that's also really interesting for how we think about how you literally imagine your future, because the way that we do it is often it's anchored to something, right? It's anchored on or hooked on dreams or ideas or the things you see other people doing. But if you don't see that, or you see it and you know that, well, they've got housing independence because they come from a family that's got some money behind them that can support you, but you have no hammock underneath you, no one's catching you. I think that has a real effect on how and if people can dream.
Yeah, yeah, and I think you've said so many beautiful things that I want to kind of take it step by step and really take our time here, because I think this is really like touching on the crux of the issue for me. So you mentioned obviously there were some similarities and differences across Europe. Can you talk to me a little bit more about what you found? What were some of the stuff that was similar in these countries or different?
Yeah, absolutely. I think on the first hand, you have cultural differences and expectations. So without wanting to stereotype, I'll say that at the front, that in particular in parts of Southern Europe, there are different expectations around family, and you often find that people were moving out of the family home later anyway. And part of that is cultural, part of it is about expectations around care within families. Part of it can be gendered in that way. So a lot of younger women might stay at home to look after family and then move out to look after their own families that they have. And part of it is also related to education. So, in particularly in the part of Italy where we're researching in Sardinia, it's quite common for young people to go to their local university and stay living at home. So being migrating for university, even within a country, the way that happens most often in the UK, that's not the same kind of expectation. But in particular in Southern Europe, so we still notice changes in when people felt like they could be or would expect to feel independent in that way, in terms of where they live and who they live with. Climate change came up an awful lot more, and I imagine that's because of a sense of one experiencing extreme heat the last few years, and the effects of that. There were also very extreme flooding. There was extreme flooding that happened in Spain when we were doing some of the field work, and these skyrocketing heats. So I think there's an idea and a reality of an exposure to climate change too.
Yeah.
And I think in the UK as well, there's for a lot of young people, there's a real sense of an understanding that the government often, the state, and often right-wing politicians have this idea that everyone wants to come here for immigration. And that's not the idea. People aren't coming because they think this is a great place to live. They're coming often because they have family connections, and there's another connection there. So for a lot of young people who took part in the project, whether they were from migrant families or not, there's kind of a sense that, this is not the country that maybe some people think it is. This is not the place where you have ease of access to a job or welfare or housing. These things feel really out of reach. So that's where we're kind of seeing those differences there. And then as we're starting to do more research in Ireland and the Netherlands, we also see it playing out slightly differently there. So one of my colleagues in the Netherlands describes it as being like the Netherlands kind of being a bit behind maybe where the UK is now, and a feeling of young people struggling with some of these elements. And in Ireland, it's actually been for a longer period. So parts of Ireland were particularly impacted by the global financial crisis. So that impacted their housing market in a very specific way. So you've got these cultural differences, you've got these economic differences, but I would say despite all that, you actually find a lot more similarity between.
I think that's so fascinating. I think there's an element of like it feels kind of I don't feel alone, or my generation doesn't feel alone to understand that this is something across Europe, because it tends to feel like it's something just really aimed at us, and we think about migrating, we think about going other places, but yeah, I think it's a generational thing we're feeling across Europe. On that point that you talked about intergenerational, or like us comparing ourselves to another generation, but what we thought we would be to another generation's actual reality. Can you talk a bit more about that? What did you find when people talked about them comparing themselves to any people